Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming out. The first thing that we need you to understand is there has to be a disclaimer. We are going to make your brain hurt, but it's good. I also do not speak on behalf of any of my employers or contracts or anything. You didn't hear this from me. I'm not here. It didn't happen. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. That goes for Tiffany, too. We're not actually here.
Is your mic on?
Yeah, it's on. Can't hear me? Okay. Go.
Hi, I'm Tiffany Rad. I am a professor in the computer science department at University of Southern Maine. So I have a tech background. I'm also an attorney. Intellectual property and cybercrimes is my specialty. And I am starting a clinic at the law school. It's going to be one of the first, and we're hoping to get some Homeland Security funding for it. We're going to be getting computer science students, IT students, working with the attorneys, so both have communication, both on technical and legal aspects of handling computer law and cybercrimes cases. And I'm also the organizer of Hack Me, a hackerspace in Portland, Maine, the only hackerspace in Portland, Maine. And this is James.
So I'm a part-time security consultant, a part-time chief information security officer, part-time, I do some security writing, and most of the time I'm just that guy. I'm that guy for you. Tiffany's the lawyer.
These are some definitions that we're just going to put out there very quickly to talk. So when we're discussing some of these aspects of it, I'll have a little bit of a framework for it. Sorry. Thank you. Stored data and communications, those have a little bit of a different threshold than in-transit communications. Stored data is, a lot of it's coming under the eCPA, and the eCPA has requirements for when data has stopped moving and it's sitting in a server, usually 180 days. It takes more legal challenges to get data off of servers or places where it has stopped. A legal person, we're talking about legal as in, it doesn't actually have to be a person. Corporations are legal entities. They're treated as similar to the way people are. So we'll be talking a little bit about later how computers and companies, the question we have is, are they treated similar as people for other types of law, or will they be in the future? A legal adult is something we're talking about as well. It relates to an AI concept we're going to be discussing about gaining consciousness. And when a computer is making contracts for you, similar to like shrink wrap licenses, for instance, is it implicitly making a contract under which it can be, well, you or your computer can have for legal consequences? And see. Sorry, you cover the non-compos mentis, please.
So every now and then in law, we have to make a statement that the person, legal person or corporate person that you're dealing with isn't actually able or capable of taking care of themselves and making decisions for themselves. At some point in the future, hopefully, but it could be happening to you right now, parts of your brain could no longer be considered competent. This has happened to me.
Not common law. There are some other countries that follow common law more so than we do. Common law jurisdiction here in the U.S. would be a Commonwealth of Massachusetts, for instance, Commonwealth of Virginia. But some countries follow common law. We generally don't have as much common law as other countries do. Tort law has to do with injuries to persons, to people, to that's tort. That's what it is injuries. Jurisdiction has to do with where an event occurs and where it can be prosecuted or traced. And we are going to talk about jurisdiction in relation to, for instance, offshore platforms in the middle of the ocean. If you have servers out there, and there have been with Sealand and Haven Co., where the jurisdiction exists. And it's a tricky legal question, and it's one that the U.S. law is still struggling with now. Agent, not secret or corporate, you could be an agent for your company, even though you're not the CEO or CTO or CEO. You can make contracts as an agent. That's just specifically what that means in contract. We all have signed contracts. Some of them are implied, some are implicit, some are explicit. We're going to talk about some of those contracts.
So data and document are sometimes, but not always, used interchangeably. You may have noticed something that the vast majority of the people who make the laws existed in a time before there were computers. and they don't necessarily distinguish between them. So we're going to come up with some working definitions. When we're talking about data, we're talking about the lowest level of abstraction that we can have. It's the ones and zeros, bytes in the correct order. A document is a bounded physical representation of a body of information. This is the tokenization problem. So humans like to move tokens around, we like to shuffle things, so we've created this concept of an electronic document where it's a bundle of information with a specific setup and format. So we've got this idea of living persons, and we understand that. Business organizations are also sometimes persons. They can make contracts, they can sue and be sued, and the trouble for getting around the law aspect of it is that corporations don't actually have a voice. They need someone to speak on their behalf. So there's this notion of agency, that you're an authorized officer or director of a corporation, or that you are an agent who is authorized to make statements, decisions, enter into legal contracts on behalf of that corporation and all of its shareholders.
The stored communications, as I mentioned earlier, I already covered some of this, but when it's come to rest on a device, server, for instance, it is protected. It's not for instance, if AOL in Virginia has very strict cybercrimes laws because of the server banks that are in Virginia. They want jurisdiction, and the computers that they have there, when data is coming through that or criminal activities are originating other places, a lot of them do come through Virginia computers. They say, okay, we're going to take jurisdiction and stop there. So when it's on a device, that's what we're talking about with the ECPA, Communications Protection Act. And in-transit communications between servers is coming from overseas to the US. The Fourth Amendment is search and seizure. That's in a nutshell. It covers, you do have rights when you're here in the US. We're going to briefly cover some of those when you're walking around, the difference between like a Terry stop and a warrant for someone to search your bags. But we were talking a little bit about at the border how things change. If you're coming from Canada through U.S. Customs, you have different rights than if you're a U.S. citizen coming through Customs. But in Customs, things are a little bit different. You're sort of in no man's land in a way, and a lot of, for instance, the U.S. seizing computers for a reason. For suspicion. They'll take your computer and look through it, and so that's what we're talking about. For at the borders, things are different.
You got to remember that this idea that the Fourth Amendment exists, there are so many exceptions to it that it's beyond the point of being Swiss cheese riddled with holes. There's not much actual structure left. There are so many exceptions, and being aware of the exceptions turns out to be sort of key.
Computers and your devices, we talk about if you have a small electronic device on you, a cell phone, a PDA, a netbook, and if you think you have more protections against, for instance, if it's in your home, if you carry it on your person, that's a little bit different. We're going to talk about that later, but you still can get a search warrant if, or people can for reasonable searches, reasonable suspicion that there's something on those devices. Plain sight is if, for instance, you have a computer, or actually it's easier if there's something laying in the backseat of your car. If you're pulled over for a reason that's laying out, they can ask to look at that and take that if you are arrested. The warrants are applicable to cell phone, PDAs, car computers, and we're talking about medical devices now too, because there's so many medical devices that do use RFID to connect to be read, Bluetooth. They have internet connections, and they are uploading and downloading data, downloading their new software and uploading data about your statistics, what's going on with you. And the warrants do cover those. Those are not devices that law enforcement could just take from you. They need a warrant for those. The Fifth Amendment, it's just, you don't have to incriminate yourself. Like, for instance, I have a case going on in Maine now where a student of mine is going to be talking as not an expert witness, but in a case about some code. And there's certain questions that he doesn't have to answer. The code is not the aspect of the case, it's what the academic research was. It's helping someone else's case. But there are certain questions such as, did you test this code? Have you used this code on these particular protected computers? And he doesn't have to answer those. This is not he's not being tried. And he can claim the fifth for that if it becomes something that prosecution wants to push.
I'd like to point out that we don't have an equivalent right in Canada, and these rights all evaporate at the border. They simply don't exist. I want you to think about the fact that the law treats data in so many different ways. So this conversation about information becomes very, very difficult right from the outset. So we're going to back up and we're going to ask you for just a little while. We're going to think about stored data information, not data in motion. So when I'm trying to protect my data, I think, the first thing I'm going to do is, well, it's 2009, I'm going to put it in the cloud, baby. It's going to be all in Google Apps because those are perfectly safe and nobody could ever guess my password.
You really think so, James?
Yes, I do. I believe in the cloud.
Okay.
Chris Hoff told me to.
Oh. So you think you put your stuff in the cloud and it's protected, it's secret, no one can trace that to you?
Right.
Oh, sorry, you're wrong about that. There are terms of service agreements with Google, and well, if we're talking about Google Docs, they've also been very readily eager to turn over some information about users.
That doesn't sound fair. Okay, well then I'm not going to leave it in documents because the law treats data and documents differently. I'm going to just keep my data on Amazon S3 storage because that also never fails and just keeps working every time. And Kindle.
Kindle? Did you say Kindle? Sorry, James.
That's not helping. All right, so I'm going to rent a server. It's going to be my server at Rackspace because they're going to take care of me. It's my server. I'm renting it from them.
All right, I'm the prosecution here, James, and if you think that renting a server and putting your stuff on someone else's box makes it so that I can't get it, you're wrong about that. I'm still going to get a warrant, and we're going to go get that data.
I'm going to buy a server, then it's mine.
Where's your server going to be?
I'm going to put it at the ISP of the town I live in.
Oh, at the ISP.
Mom and pop.
Yeah, okay.
They'll take care of me.
Yeah, sorry. There's going to be a warrant, and I'm going to probably get that if I have reason to.
I'm going to put it in my house.
In your house.
Because my home, sanctity, man.
Sanctity, I'm sorry. If it's in your home, the one thing that is different is that there may be a few more, procedural protections. If you rent some rack space somewhere, that company you are under the terms of service that they will turn over that stuff maybe more readily than you were. And if the computer's in your home, you could say, hey, I'm going to challenge that warrant, maybe more so than a corporation would. But that's it. It's still going to be there, and I'm going to find it.
I'm going to put it on my laptop, and I'm never going to set it down.
So you're going to keep it on your body, and you think that's going to be a lot different.
I'll put it in a Ziploc bag to shower.
No.
That doesn't sound fair. All right, I know that phones are treated differently under law than plain old computing devices.
Oh, where did you hear that?
In the 90s.
Okay. They're considered to be computing devices, and the same requirements for a computer, we're going to do the same thing on your smartphone.
Fine, I'm going to put it on a memory card. I'm going to keep it very close and safe, just like in prison.
Then just like in prison, you're going to have to find out what it's like to have someone remove that if you've been arrested.
I'll use encryption.
Is that the encryption you're using?
That's the encryption that I made up when I typed the slide. I'm going to use the real kind of encryption. I'm going to base 64 encode it.
Oh. Well, then I'm going to say there's a case in Vermont that happened last year. It was someone coming from, I believe from Canada, in fact, and they said, I'm not giving up my key. And the court said, yes, you will. You will give that up.
Yeah, but the DMCA does that.
Oh, so you're talking about that part in the DMCA where it says if there's minimal security protection, some encryption, if I go beyond that, then I've violated the DMCA. No, sorry.
So the law doesn't work for me, it works for them. Fine, I'll use commercial encryption or non-commercial encryption because I'm feeling a little free today.
Then it may actually be easier to get some of those keys.
You're not helping me. I'm going to make up my own encryption because I'm Bruce Schneier.
But recall that Bruce Schneier gets a get out of jail free pass. He's Bruce Schneier. It's research.
I'm a researcher.
You're not Bruce Schneier.
Okay, fine. So that's data at rest. I'm going to keep my data constantly moving. I'm going to be sending packets around the world. They'll be hopping from system to satellite. It's a big ring of data that hugs the earth.
It sounds like you're talking about jurisdiction hopping. It can be done, and procedurally, if you are the feds, it's a lot more difficult to track that stuff down. But there are companies that, for instance, if something is a copyright violation here in the US, they will find another country where it's not. It's very expensive to do, and you're going to have to keep moving because eventually they're going to catch up.
Okay, so we've been talking about all this data without really giving you any reason why we're talking about it. And besides that, you all think we're going to talk about your brain. The data is your brain, actually, in a couple of different ways. I just want you to think for a minute, though, about this idea of personal effects, because it's going to become really important really soon. So when we talk about personal effects, what do we mean?
We're talking about personal effects such as your thoughts. When you're in public, if you're talking to a friend in public, one of the questions is, when we look at Fourth Amendment stuff, is do you have a reasonable expectation of privacy? So if you're in the middle of the hallway there and talking about some really great malicious code that you think you found, and do you think you have a reasonable expectation of privacy in the hall when you're talking about that? How about if you're in the hallway and there's some new cameras we're going to be talking about that Homeland Security is going to be implementing, and you're just thinking it? Do you have a reasonable expectation of privacy if you're standing out there and you're thinking about it, but maybe you're sweating, and maybe there's some pheromone response that you can't control? Maybe there's some pupil dilation, and someone's watching that camera. Do you think you have a reasonable expectation of privacy then? That's the question that we're addressing, is what kind of information you are putting out in public, and if that's protected or not.
Okay, so imagine that it's still the 90s. I'll have a slightly different haircut with blonde tips. I have a PDA. It has names, addresses, phone numbers, relationships, and I'm starting to store notes in there about awesomeness that's happening in my brain. Is that still thought?
That's a really good question, because James and I were talking about this, that if you store your present thoughts, and we'll talk about this, like, for instance, Twitter. I am doing this right now. Is that something that you have a reasonable expectation of privacy? If it's Twitter, no way. But if it's your PDA, and you use your PDA because you have either a short-term memory problem or you just write down every single thing that happens to you, there isn't a different, that is different in the sense that it's obviously a different medium. You're not broadcasting to the public, but if there is a search warrant on that, it's not going to be, and if it's something in those notes that they think is pertinent to the search, that's not going to be protected as if you're speaking it or if you're thinking it privately.
So the copy of all those notes that are now stashed on the BlackBerry Enterprise server, that's bad, right? I'm getting more and more uncomfortable as we get further through this. So what about, it's not that I'm trying to remember something, but I need to do something. So, I can admit that I'm vain. I run a running Google search alert on my name to find out when people are saying bad things about me. The computer's doing things for me. Is it my agent?
It depends on, I believe, when you've agreed to set it up. We were talking about automatic updates from Microsoft or whatever operating system you're using. When the end user license agreement, when you click on yes, I agree, if it's set up to do it automatically, your computer's doing that for you. Or for instance, if you write a script, as I have done, because I have a company and I have to file annual reports, sometimes I miss the deadline, it's a big fine. So if I write a script that does it for me and says, yes, we're legally operating in the state of Maine, we're doing this business, it does it for me, it takes money from my bank account and gives it to the state. The question is the computer doing the job for me? Is it not me making the contract and agreement with the state, but my computer?
My computer accepts meetings for me. And people think that there's a contract. If I said I'll show up to a meeting, that I'll show up. Mostly. It is starting to sound like agency, though. So can we draw some sort of a legal bright line, to say the computer is not my brain and my brain is not the computer? This stuff is all kind of glued together in an ugly way.
Well, ugly. Perhaps, I don't know if I'd say ugly, but it is becoming, as technology, with people are using Twitter more often, it's becoming more difficult to distinguish your thoughts from that which you put in public. And It's,
The things that I'm thinking right now.
yeah,
That's not good.
you're sweating. I think I can tell a little bit about what you're thinking. Are you nervous? Are you thinking of, is it a pre-crime type of thought?
Maybe. Okay, so answer these questions for me. How am I related to my computer?
You're related to your computer in the sense that it's a device that you've purchased. You purchased the plastic, the screen, the LCD, but when it comes to the software on it, you license that. The same thing applies to, as I was talking to some people earlier, your car. You own the leather, the metal of the car, the aluminum, whatever. But when it comes to the software and the computers that control a lot of what your car does and records about you, that is something that you don't own, you never will. You have a license to that. So you don't own all of your car, you don't own everything that's on your computer in the sense that it is all yours.
Okay, my data. I bought that micro SD card that I'm keeping close.
Well, if it's data you put on the micro SD card, you don't own, okay, maybe you own the plastic and what's, the software that's the firmware that runs on that. But the data that's on that, if it is something that's pertinent to a search that's being done with a warrant, that is still something that is accessible.
That's not good. This is starting to sound like I need my own lawyer just to conduct my own life. Is there a conspiracy here? So, can I even own a computer? I mean, I can own a carrot.
It's in the sense that you own the hard stuff that you can touch, the tangible stuff. Although, as TiVo pours goo over a lot of their hardware, that you can't see what's under it. You can see what's under it, but whether you open it up and don't violate the DMCA if you are accessing that, that's something that you don't own, that software.
You're not making this nice. So, if the computer's not mine, really, I mean, other corporations have an interest in it, other entities have an interest in it, then can it still be an agent for me?
It can be an agent for you if you set it up as such.
That's not good. There's all kinds of other places where we get non-entities making contracts and decisions. They don't happen very often, but I think they're going to happen a whole lot more often, and it's something that we sort of have to be very aware of. Anybody familiar with the term expert-based systems? Yeah, when they start deciding how your life is going to be lived, are you going to be okay with that? I might not be. So do I have an explicit contract with my computer where it must do what I say?
It's, to answer this question, it's similar to like a shrink wrap license with software. There are times when you buy something and when you open it and turn it on, you're agreeing to those terms, whether you've read them or not. If it's shrink wrap, you cannot. And that's something that contract law has really struggled with, this concept, and with the software and hardware industry.
It's very uncomfortable working with lawyers sometimes. They don't tell you what you want to hear. Can my computer end up in a situation where, from legal perspective, it's actually alive? It's become a legal person?
There was a project at Carnegie Mellon when I was an undergrad, and some people I knew were trying to get a computer to be a legal entity in the sense that they were going to try to get it a social security number. That didn't work. But the plan was to see if it could vote, if it could make contracts online, if it could set up a bank account, do some of those things that we all do. And the computer, if it's thinking even on a much, much lower level of cognizance than we are, is it alive? Is it something that is making decisions for us and can be sued?
So if we could turn it into an agent, well, what does that really mean? How do we figure out, when something is capable of being an agent? When something is capable of making legal decisions?
When we're talking about, for instance, trials, either for civil or criminal, when the court is assessing whether a child is competent to stand trial, they judge that child's an evaluation, psychological evaluation, on the age of that child. But if that child is using a device, such as the accident, for instance, in torts it happened with a car or a boat, a child driving a boat, they will often hold the child to the legal responsibility of someone who is old enough to drive a car. So that's why James and I were talking about what's the age of being an adult to make a contract.
Turns out it varies between age 7 and age 21, depending on exactly what you're talking about and which state you're in. I have a 7-year-old. She's not able to make decisions like that. She's not an adult. But on the other hand, we are at the point where computers can operate like 7-year-olds. I mean, YouTube seems to be a pretty big fan of Miley Cyrus. No?
And you're looking at me, yeah.
Well, you're a girl. So we've got this idea of cognitive maturity. The law knows how to handle it. They have tests for it. If you sit down in a court and you're mentally incapacitated in some way not related to being me, they can figure out if you're able to answer questions as a witness or if you can make decisions as a child in a contested divorce case. Can we take those tests and use them?
That would be interesting. I think there have been some tests done. Carnegie Mellon did some with AI about what kind of educational level is a computer operating on, and it is interesting. But legally, I don't think that's been applied to computers just yet about legal liability for acts that they have done, even if it's on, it's on the owner's behalf at this point.
Okay, so if they're kind of representing my thoughts, they're part of how my brain works, and my brain is sort of protected. They can't read my thoughts yet, right? That's not right, is it? So I've taken the memories out of my head. I no longer actually know my own phone number. I keep my phone number on my little belt pack brain. So is that okay? I don't actually know important dates either. I kind of know my kid's birthday, but that's only because it's written on my leg. I have no idea what I'm doing next Thursday. And you can't take away my phone. Do you want to talk about being the Twitter kind of person? Because I'm kind of a Twitter person.
I think I'm kind of one too.
I've been live tweeting this whole thing.
When people think that when they post things on Twitter that it's just, I have a contract with Twitter and they're not going to turn over information about me tweeting about the next place where illegal activities are going on. And you know what? That's public information. When we talk about the difference between private and public, you're broadcasting to everyone out there. It's like a directory. And besides hitting the delete button, that's still being logged. So if you tweet something and oops, I didn't really want that direct message to go to every 500 people I knew, you can take that back, but Twitter's not going to take that back. It's there. And when people are broadcasting their location and what they're thinking, and it's just something that isn't private. And if you think it is, I hope no one in this room thinks it is. There are a lot of people I talk to at the university who think it is. And that's not something that is protectable in the sense that you say it's your own. It's on Twitter.
But I want cloud memory. I do. I want to be able to take all those things that are in my life that relate to work that I'm doing and stuff that's going on with companies that I don't like and those people that I really... Do you have a list? I have a list of people. There's nobody in the room who's on the list, otherwise I'd be working on the list. Can I put that in the cloud?
If you put that in the cloud, you're still putting information. Well, it depends on how you have that data secured, but it is something that if it's information you really don't want anyone ever to get, you're going to have to put that back in your mind. There are ways that you can protect data by challenging warrants, but if it's right and the warrant is justified, the companies will turn that over if it's in the cloud or not.
Okay, well, I'm going to trust Microsoft to keep track of everything that goes on in my life. This is a real product. It's not widely for sale yet, but it is used for Alzheimer's patients. I'm going to have a Microsoft device record everything that I do so that I can review it. I'm going to be the next generation human.
It's protectable in the sense that it requires a warrant for that information to be extracted from that device.
Okay. I did it to myself. I agreed to be a digerati back when Wired 1.01 came out. But what if I don't have an option?
There are different kinds of medical devices, and we're working on one back in New England for an interesting company that does blood glucose meters. And there are also some meters that are for anti-seizure devices. And it records your biometric, your biodata, and it stores it on a device and it transmits that information. It's disappointing to see that not all companies, I guess because some of them consider this is a medical device, this isn't a laptop or a cell phone, some of that's not encrypted. And if you're, for instance, Dick Cheney and you have a pacemaker of which someone by the last name of Goodspeed knows about how that chip works, it's concerning that those devices do have security vulnerabilities just like an operating system when they need to be patched. But those kinds of devices, it seems like they're not being protected as much as actual other electronic devices you carry. They're wearable, so and they record a lot of personal identifying information about you.
Like, well, I'm sweating right now. That's not good. So, what about CCTV?
CCTV is interesting in the sense that we're here in Vegas. You know you're on camera almost all of the time. Imagine if you lived in a city where it was like that. For instance, if you lived in London. I think the average person in London is on a camera at some time every day. It's about 7 times a day. And the thing that's interesting about just the CCTVs is you are going out in public, you are presenting yourself in public. If you don't want to be on those cameras and if you're in a public place, interesting by the way, this applies for you shopping at Walmart. If you don't want to be on their cameras and don't want to be used for their shelf stocking programs that they run, don't shop in Walmart. But it applies when you're walking on the city street as well. So you've given permission in the sense that you're in public, your image can be seen. And the question is about when that's attributed to personal identifying information. The Homeland Security Department has a new camera, and it was tested about 4 months ago in Maryland. They paid about 200 volunteers to walk through something the size of a trailer. They're going to be much smaller. In fact, we have some pictures of what they're going to be. But there are a lot of biometric scans that it does, and they're planning on putting these in airports. On their website, the Homeland Security Department says that this is Minority Report actually happening in real life. And what's interesting is some people will be like, that was an awesome movie, but I'm not sure I want to live in a world where that happens and is not checked. Who owns that information about you? If you're going through TSA and you're a little bit nervous, this camera, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, looks for pupil dilation, contraction, pheromone response. If you're sweating, if you're shiftiness, they already have certain types of behavioral screening they do right now. It's getting some false positives that are pretty high. Right now, this fast camera is also, the inaccuracies so far are too much for them to actually put it in airports right now. And the device is too big, but they're coming out with a small portable one, I believe in about 6 months. And they're going to start testing that on more paid volunteers. But this is the type of information that we're talking about in this talk. When you're in public, your face, your image, you're moving around in public places or in a private place like Walmart where you've implicitly given permission to be recorded. But with this, even though if you're just walking in a public place and this is there, they may not have your name, but if they're running your facial geometry against a list, that's something also. You're in public, the way that your face, it measures, for instance, like where the measurements between the eyes and the cheekbones. You're in public. The way I feel about that is, if they're measuring that, and they do this in casinos a lot, in fact, I know they do here at Caesars too, and they run it against a database of people count cards or criminals. If you're caught and picked up from that, that's something you put in public. But if it's your thoughts that they're measuring, that these cameras are actually being sold as pre-crime detectors. So
right now, it's okay for me to think bad thoughts. My list, I can think about, but I keep all that inside my skull. Right? If I'm broadcasting it, if I'm making it known publicly, could it be legally construed that I'm declaring intent?
The way that from what I've read from the research, the Homeland Security Department's put down, this is a pre-crime detector. They have said that they would like to catch people before they go through security who are thinking about creating criminal acts.
Okay, so.
It's about committing a crime with their call.
So just repeating the question so everybody can hear, what is how does it work, essentially, is the question. How are they making sure that they can figure this out? Some of the research was done, we have to take some blame here, blame Canada. Some of the research was done in Canada. What they do is they measure the infrared output of your skull, and they can tell which parts of your brain are working and whether or not that suits the general distribution pattern. So if your brain doesn't work quite the way other people's do, you'll probably be flagged. It's based on a whole number of different things. Part of it, this is a good example. This is the training they're doing with people now. They're trying to automate it because people are expensive. They're trying to automate the same training. Recently, Tiffany was describing a case where a group of military-dressed people were moving through airport security, and they're very jittery and shifty, and they weren't making eye contact with anyone in the same way that I've avoided eye contact for the last 40 minutes. They ended up being pulled aside for screening because there was a significant concern that they were going to do something bad. They're behaving in a way that's bad. Computers are really good at measuring those kinds of things. If you ramp up the speed to sort of Mythbusters level, you're able to look at whether somebody is shifting back and forth from one side to the other. You can see the sweat pop out on their skin. You can tell that they haven't locked eyes for long enough. So all of those things, it becomes statistical norms against what they're perceiving. Once they put all that stuff together, they can get a picture of, are you inside the bell curve or outside the bell curve? Question in the middle.
So you just described several nervous flyers then.
The question was, so you've just described nervous flyers. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I think that's in the narrow scope of moving through an airport, yes, you're absolutely right. In the wider scope of this is software that just needs an input in the form of an MPEG file, where else is this going to start to show up? That's starting to be a question and a concern. If your thoughts can be read at a distance, there's this idea in Fourth Amendment that around your person counts. There's a sphere or a cylinder around you. If that gets too big, is there really a protection there? Is everything that goes on inside of you now outside of you? And how is that okay? I've got like 3 or 4 over here, but I don't know which one came up first. Near the front.
At what point is a system like this become probable cause for search or legal action?
Well, if you're going through airport security, if you meet the criteria that they have, they will pull you aside and ask you questions. So you're asking at what point would this? They have specific guidelines they need to follow, which they don't need to release all those to the public. They don't, in fact, but. Oh, so okay. If this isn't an airport and you're going through security, if it's probable search. If you're going through security and they have a reason to believe that this is suggested you have some pre-crime thoughts, that gives them the probable cause to pull you aside and ask you questions. If you're on a city street and you're walking around and this is reading, in fact, they were going to use these at stadiums or other places where there might be a risk for biological or chemical weapons. I believe that this will give them probable cause if someone's watching it and wants to go ask you some questions. So I don't think it's too far from that. If it's reasonable that they would believe that you're going to commit some kind of crime and the technology tells them so, I think that's it. They're trying to, well, that's a good question with intent. Intent, if there is a crime committed, they do go and look back. You have to look at intent. It changes a lot. Like in cybercrimes, intent's a big deal. Did you intend to steal this, or was it just you were looking around and you broke in? They're trying to avoid anyone committing these crimes by telling, hey, these are in operation. The thing that's interesting with this, though, is the pheromone response and the blood pressure. They have an algorithm they've created with psychologists that they believe, and psychologists do, will eventually become very accurate in determining thoughts. So. I think if we're talking about being on camera and you're passing through some public place, I don't think that's enough. Okay, I don't think that's enough.
I'm going to be the Canadian and say yet, and watch what happens when they extend conspiracy to commit law to cover it.
Should we take questions more toward the end?
Yeah, we have a short stack to get through, and then we'll
there's a
hit
question
ton
over
of
here
questions.
for a while that we'll take you first because you've had your hand up.
This is just to ask about probable cause.
Oh, okay, great.
Okay, so that's all fine and good, but if we're getting a whole lot of biometric data collected, can we use biometrics for anything else?
This is something that corporations are beginning to use too. I read a case, and it happened it's been going on for a while at Walt Disney World. They're having everyone put their hands into a hand geometry scanner, and including children, and children who are unaccompanied by adults, such as 16-year-olds visiting the park. It's still the same. They collect that data, and the question is, what is Disney doing with that, and do they have ability to collect it? And even though it's not attributed to people's names when they put their hand in, but when they use this is for people who have season passes. It wouldn't be too tough to make one be close to the other. And what we're talking about here is with RFID, here in Vegas, there's some casinos, I don't know if Caesars is one of them, where employees working the tables have to wear pretty much like a collar and around their ankle, and it determines same thing. If either they are the victim of a crime, if someone's holding up the table, or if they're thinking about doing something illegal. This is supposed to, some of these are being used to determine that there might be a crime, and I think the pit boss will then focus in the cameras and get a better look.
So I need to know that the stuff that I'm thinking about stays on the inside. I've stopped willingly Twittering my life, and I'll somehow stop using my BlackBerry. What do I do? How do I move forward in reality? I can't live in this world that way.
Well, I don't think this is all grounds for quitting using technology, but it is be smarter about how you're using it. And if you don't want yourself out in the public and what you're doing, maybe don't Twitter quite so much with GPS.
There's never been flawed software though, right? Yet. And nobody likes to exploit flaws in software, flaws in algorithms. So can we turn this whole thing upside down? Can we make it so that the computers are in charge?
Well, the question is, would we want to do that?
Can the government retroactively just change things on us?
Well, when it is in regard to criminal law, they can't retroactively prosecute. If you've already been through the system and you've been charged, it's saying, hey, there's a new criminal law, you're going to do 10 more years. That can't happen. Civilly, though, as you know, with licensing agreements, things can be changed around. They can change access to different parts of the software after you bought them, or Kindle.
I'm not happy now. Kind of sad, actually. This isn't good. I'm not a lawyer, I'm just a security dude.
And I'm a lawyer, but not yours. All lawyers have to say that, sorry. It's in there. So now we're going to talk about basic guidelines for what you use. Some of it is very basic, but we'll talk a little bit more about specifics too.
So as much as I really want to use the cloud, that puts other companies in charge of my stuff.
Oh, Chris Hoff's not going to be happy to hear you say that.
I miss Chris, he's not here. So I'm going to keep all my stuff in my house.
Only in the sense that it might give you more control over if there are warrants being issued. Who's following that? You're the one turning over the data. You're there, as opposed to if a company's doing it. That's a little bit different.
Okay, I'm going to use encryption more often and regularly.
Right. Good job.
I think, but I'm not going to go to the tinfoil hat extreme. I wear my tinfoil hat on the inside where people can't see that it's there. Because when I wear the tinfoil hat on the outside, they're going to look harder. They do know how to look for TrueCrypt encrypted partitions and hidden partitions. Is it really right now, or can we do it at the end? Okay. What about the idea of just storing it in difficult to subpoena places? I'm going to keep it at my beach house in Aruba.
Well, jurisdiction hopping, as I mentioned, is possible. It's expensive, and it just takes a little bit longer. But unless it's a country that's completely hostile to the U.S., then you have to question, do you really want your stuff in that country? But offshore platforms are becoming a lot cheaper now. I was reading for about 2 to 3 million. They're going to be placed in places where it's going to be more difficult to be subpoenaed. And Haven Co. claimed they were subpoena-proof, but when it came down to it, this is a offshore platform that's off the coast of the UK. They claimed they were subpoena-proof, but what's tough is that the jurisdiction of that platform was always in question. And since everyone who's there gets health insurance from the UK, and if you're from the UK, you know that's like citizenship. Yeah, that was one of the aspects with jurisdiction. And I believe the jurisdiction might be changing a little bit with offshore platforms. It depends, honestly, of how they're anchored and how close they are to the shelf of like off the UK.
I'm going to make friends with Richard Branson and launch a satellite. He and I can keep data on it, nobody else.
When your data comes back here, if it touches one of the states in the US, it's still going to be a point at which that's where we'll say, the data has touched this, we're going to take jurisdiction in Nevada, Virginia, Canada.
Blame Canada.
Yeah.
So the other thing that we're going to ask, and this is from me to you, please, let's be aware of these newly forming cognitive agents. Okay, there's not a bright line where we can say yes or no whether something is cognitive. I know that my copy of Microsoft Outlook at work is making agreements with people on my behalf. That's happening every day. I'd like to limit the capability of my Microsoft software to make decisions and agreements on my behalf. And what it comes down to at the end of the day is we've got to work to educate and understand and comprehend and look willingly at what we're doing before we do it.
And for the civil liberties, we need to consider the privacy implications of these new technologies. We need to concern ourselves with the fact of what we think is private, what we're thinking, if there are cameras that suggest that they can read our pre-crime thoughts, of how far our personal civil liberties extend. And maybe those need to change a little bit as these technologies become more prevalent and are put in public.
We know that we're talking about stuff that sounds like science fiction. It was actually one of our very major concerns when we were putting this together. We have to ground everything because it's not in a sci-fi book. But you know that speculative fiction tends to come true every now and then. Spock had something like this in 1967. We're not actually talking about crazy stuff. We just want you to be aware that what you think is yours might not be yours today, and it's certainly not going to be yours in the future. There are too many other organizations, governments, corporations that have an interest in knowing what's going on inside your skull. Do your part, engage with the public, help people to understand. You know, we all went through this, how to teach everybody to do safe browsing, teach people how to do safe action in public, how to do safe things with their data, how to not reuse the same password on different sites. We have to be aware of what we're doing. We have to consider the implications before it happens. Right now, the system of law is set up to be reactive. After the problems have all surfaced, then we get new laws, and the laws are usually not well written. We've got to fix it before it happens this time. This is our whole world in less than 10 years.
And as we are continuously, in some places, monitored, just be careful. You know, if especially here in Vegas, before you decide to do something that you think no one's ever going to find out about, you're probably on camera if you're here in a casino in Vegas.
This would be a good example of if this was a fast camera, we would know whether or not this was second-degree car slaughter or first-degree car slaughter.
And if you're in the view of a fast camera, there will be people who will learn how to beat these fast cameras. These guys in the picture probably are not them. But just as any technology, there are going to be ways around it, and people will learn how to control their pheromone response. And I mean, I guess the feds have known how to be lie detectors, even the real new ones, for a long time. And there'll be people who will learn how to beat these fast cameras as well. Any technology, there's always going to be a hole, and someone's going to find it. But if you are one of these guys, you're going to want to be warned.
There's a whole lot of Gen Y that has the 1,000-yard stare. We've trained them to have the 1,000-yard stare. We've been busy at it, both Canada and the United States. We keep them on the other side of the world for the most part, but they're going to be able to control themselves.
And
Not so much.
just be careful. You think that you're in your neighborhood in New York, then the Google van drives by, and this could be you in a database forever. What our concern is, make sure it's not associated with any personal identifying information.
Or second-degree samurai. Now we've got time for questions, and we willingly left a ton of time for questions because we knew this was going to end up being interactive.
Actually, the guy over there had his head up for a while, so you go first.
Well, I heard a while ago that basically the platform of Sealand burned down.
They had a fire, but they've reconstructed it, and Pirate Bay tried to buy it a while back, and well, they're no more, I suppose, but they were unsuccessful. But it didn't burn down completely, it's been restored. The king and the queen or the prince, they still live there.
Back on this side, we'll work our way around.
A lot of times in the private industry, there's kind of this fight between is the company's asset and the employee's right to have some privacy on it. What are your thoughts on how the employees use encryption or other protective tools to try to protect what they perceive to be personal data on a corporate asset?
Okay, I'm going to restate my disclaimer. I am not speaking on behalf of anybody when I answer this question. The days of walled cities are over. The perimeter is dead. There's a reason there's only one walled city in North America. It doesn't work. If you want good commerce to happen, we have to stop managing the desktop, and we have to give that freedom back. We have to go back to managing the information instead of managing the object upon which the information occurs. The problem isn't blinky lights and shiny things. The problem is people. Let's work with the people to solve the problem. As far as I'm concerned, the sooner I can kick all of the laptops and desktops outside of the network and let the employees do what they want. In fact, I'll give them $1,000 every year to figure out what they want to do with their computing experience. Because from a security perspective, as a security officer, it makes my life easier to do it that way. Companies have to realize there's a very, very, very simple fact. The harder you squeeze your employees, the more your organization leaks. Stop squeezing them.
And briefly, legally, I'll just mention that if it's a standard operating procedure for employers to, for instance, log, trace, read the emails that you're sending from work, they consider that to be their property. If you are, like similar to work for hire doctrines, you're working for the company, if you're sending an email through your corporate account, that is something that they have claimed is their right to view that.
The middle. Yes.
Let's go back to giving them the opportunity. How is compelling a defendant to give up that information, essentially giving evidence against himself? How is that not a violation of the Fifth Amendment?
Well, that's the case that I was referring to in Vermont was a pornography case. Unfortunately, it was a child porn. A lot of cyber law cases are, but the case took about 3 years before the courts determined the key had to be given up. There was an argument saying that was speech on the computer, so there was some constitutional analysis of that, but it seems like thinking that key is more like a tool. It's more like a tool, and when you are speaking and asked to answer questions, that's when the Fifth Amendment protects your speech. It doesn't protect, for instance, like your computer. Well, again, if it's your computer is not you. I know we're talking about in this context. I guess it maybe in the future it could be an extension of you or your mind. But in the context of how things are happening right now, the Fifth Amendment protects you from speaking, from saying things that would incriminate you. Even if you've said that in an email on a computer that's encrypted, that's a little bit different. If that's something that has been properly obtained through warrants and they're going through it. That's different. Although I do know that there are some people who have refused to turn over keys, and you're in court and possibly in jail for a long time. Like for instance, one of the guys who bombed the World Trade Center parking garages, his computer, the encryption on that still has not been broken. He won't turn over that key. That's been a long time. He's still being held. There are a lot of other charges as well. It's not just on the key. There are a lot of other things he has going on for him, but they still can't break it. hasn't been broken.
In Canada, you're held, in cases like that, you're held at the Queen's pleasure, which means you get out when the Queen decides you get out, and not any sooner. So it's kind of different. Aaron?
I have a question going back to social networking and Twitter in regards to information accuracy. For example, in regards to legal accuracy, I use Foursquare. I'm not saying every time that I put a check-in on Foursquare that I'm necessarily there, but if something came up, at what point are we accountable for the accuracy and integrity of that information coming out there?
There's an interesting case I read about where they're kind of like Twitter and Foursquare fails, where someone said, I'm working on those slides for that presentation, and then it says that they're in a bar downtown. The accuracy of that information, I don't think anyone would claim that, well, actually, it has to do with who owns the data, and they'd have to prove that you were on your Twitter account at that time, that something was posted that alerted suspicion about something. And just like with IP addresses are not identification of this absolutely is where this person is, that person did commit the crime. In some jurisdictions where it's the first thing we have to argue is IP address does not equal identification of a person. But it is something that does come up, and the defense will often say, well, that person wasn't there, that wasn't me doing it, it was a mistake with the technology. So it is a defense, and it is being used.
So where is it going in pertaining to all of this? Are we going to be more personally accountable for the integrity of our personal data now?
I think
You
it
have
might
to
be
tell
going
the
that
truth.
way.
They're always going to hold you to did you tell the truth? I mean, you can perjure yourself.
It's delayed. It's true.
You're welcome to perjure yourself.
As we lose these rights, how do you perceive false positives as far as them following us? So once you have a false positive, and then you can't go into any other casinos, although that was a false positive.
The question is, if you're caught in a false positive situation, what happens to you? And what you just identified is the grand horror of what happens when your biometric data is lost. I don't feel so bad when my credit card data or even my health data is lost because somebody left their laptop in a cab. If my biometric data is lost, I can't undo that. There's no easy way to replace it. You can get a replacement social security number. Getting a replacement finger, much more expensive. Getting replacement retinas, everything doesn't look right. The hue control doesn't work.
So what will our rights
The example that
become stricter as far as that has to be purged?
the example that I'll give is the UK DNA database, where they extract your DNA if you are potentially involved in a situation. If they have any reason to suspect, they extract your DNA. If you are not subsequently charged, they are supposed to purge it, but they kind of don't. So your DNA is on file forever.
Yeah, and I got to warn too that for those of you who had kids, this is another thing with DNA data in a database that often newborn babies, they do a little blood test, and the blood test, they store some of that blood. And sometimes it is used for different tests, to test to see if someone has the same bone marrow as someone else who's in need of it. But what is a problem is when some hospitals, especially about 6 years ago, didn't even tell people that it was going into a database forever. That's your child's DNA. And there will be a lot in the future you can determine from people's DNA that insurance companies, for instance, will care a lot about. So protecting your biological, your data like that is, I think, going to be as important as what we're talking about today is protecting your computer data, the stuff on your cell phone. But being careful where you leave information. You're all over, I'm sure, the cameras here in Caesars and every other place you go. And they do get false positives because facial geometry scanning is not very accurate. They get a lot of false positives. So just be more careful or be cognizant of where you go. And because no longer can you just be completely anonymous in public like I think you could about 20 years ago. Okay, a question in the back, quickly.
Yeah, in information security, we all know that there's no one single shield that's perfect, right? You layer the goals, fault, and everything, you try to minimize and mitigate. You presented a set of tools for the man as an offender, we're going to consider him that look pretty daunting, right? But nothing's perfect. So, as a lawyer, right, like if you were to take an explanation or make a suggestion, what set of more definitively, not just like don't look suspicious, or like, if I go to some bad, what country do I want to be in, right? That kind of stuff, right? So if you had someone that comes to you, say, hey, I'm going to go do something bad, what should I be? I say,
As a lawyer, if I know someone's coming to me and says something, I'm going to do something really bad, I have to report that actually by my rules of ethics. Not just me personally, but it's the way that we're licensed. If we know it's especially going to be something violent. But if a hypothetical is given on the other chance, yeah, okay, a hypothetical, that's a little bit different. We can answer hypotheticals. But your question was, if your hypothetical was, how would I recommend you protect yourself? I just think it's just know where you are. Know that if you're in some cities, you're going to be on camera more often than others. And when you're going through TSA, you are willingly subjecting yourself to that. Going through security, and then when you're getting on an airplane, you actually have a contract with the airline carrier that's separate than TSA, actually. So know that if you can't fight with the airline about what's going on with TSA. I mean, I've seen people do it all the time, and it just isn't proper. It isn't their problem. It's the government is managing TSA now, so they're government employees. They're no longer private, so you can't get upset at a private company either. But just know when you're going through places. If it's important to you, and I tell you, it would now to be anonymous in society with the way that you can no longer just go put money on a credit card and cash on a credit card without your name on it, and it's becoming really hard to do that. Cell phones, social security numbers are required. It's becoming to the point where you might have to. Well, I'm not suggesting you do, but if people do want to obscure where they are, it's breaking the law. Okay, and question here.
I just find this is going to be very interesting, particularly with things like the fast camera, as it is going to marginalize people who are medically anomalous. And yes, and it's going to, I bet, lead to an interesting industry in underground drug creation that will suppress them.
I did read about that, about pheromones, how you can artificially, I mean, those perfumes that are made to attract one sex over the other with certain traits. I used to think that that's just all, that's not science. It's turning into, it probably is. But just like with any security program you write or any facility you secure, there is always going to be a door, and there is going to be someone who's going to figure out a way around it. And usually, the people who are going to be picked up with these cameras are going to be usually the unsophisticated criminals. What's scary to anyone who's designing security systems, it's when you have to really worry about a really good crack, a really good way they got through. Those are the ones that will probably get through no matter what technology you have. And that's not to say that you shouldn't have these secure facilities and the security, but that just know it. There are always going to be ways to fake it, and the feds need to stay on, and they do. They stay on top of. Well, they're here, aren't they? They're going to be at DEF CON. They're learning, and I commend them for staying on top of learning how things are being done.
There's also a nice strong lobby there, though. Speaking as somebody who does have a neurological condition, the ADA stuff is going to step in, and that lobby is probably bigger than the lobby that we all lean on. Please donate to the EFF. That lobby is really strong, and it's going to help out, but we're going to be back in that same world where we're going to have to manage a whole lot of exceptions. And exception management is an externalized cost from their perspective. The fact that they have to put you through a ringer, they don't care about that.
How are we on time, by the way? Are we done? Oh, we have 10 more minutes. Okay.
One, in my record on my laptop is protected by fingerprint reader, as opposed to a password, aka something that me. Does that basically reflect in terms of the legality of what we do for being provide my fingerprint as opposed to my
I don't think so, because I know that in cases where you've been asked to give samples, for instance, if there's a reasonable suspicion that you did commit a crime or you fit the profile very closely of someone who did, they can take cheek swabs for DNA samples, and now they can do that, and they can ask you to do that. So you don't have to be charged per se, just as a suspicion. So they will ask you for that, and you do have to do that.
But just go back to how they do normal warrant execution. If you protect your house with a crazy set of locks and a set of passive defenses, and the cops want to get in there, they've got a warrant to get in there. They can see the bad thing through the window, right? So this is they've seen it once, so they know it exists. if they can see it, they want to get in, but they don't feel that it's safe for them to get in alone, you can be compelled to help them get through your difficult, complicated, inspired by tool locks. They'll make you do it. And it's no different than they will make you give up your encryption key, and they will cheerfully keep you in pretrial custody. They don't have a problem with that. The United States has more jails than pretty much everywhere at this point. Oh, okay. Yeah, we're screwed, by the way. Okay.
But in particular, I was interested in what your thoughts are on Canadian charter rights as regards people's facilities, and particularly neurological ones, setting off these kind of cameras and whatnot. Legal challenge down that road.
Yeah, the Canadian story is a little different. The question is, how is the law different in Canada? Because we do things differently. We have something called a charter. The charter rights stuff wouldn't kick in until after the provincial stuff is dealt with, because health is a provincial responsibility. So after it's dealt with at the provincial level, then maybe charter stuff would happen, but all of those things would have to be argued individually at each of the provincial judicial levels, and then they could be drawn up and argued at the federal level. It would be ugly, though. So yeah, it's a case where for that particular, if it's health related, Canada has the law in the wrong place. The law shouldn't be at the provincial level, it should be at the federal level, but we can't fix that because it's in the Constitution, and changing the Constitution is really hard. Back there?
I want to know why, as American citizens, we have our rights to go to the airport, and why we have our rights to go to customs. Why is this occurring? Where are American citizens? They work for us.
I got a great line here. Can I give you my great line here? Yes. Okay. Something that's very interesting about the United States. My wife's American, my kids are half and half. Very interesting about the United States, you do not have a right to enter the United States if you've left. There is no right to re-entry. Yeah, pretty much everybody else has a right to re-entry. Canada has to take me back. We're currently going through a legal challenge right now where we're being forced to take back people that we really don't want. I'm not one of them in this case, no. But the United States doesn't have right to re-entry, and from the outside perspective, and I'm only pointing this out because I've got this weird kind of dual perspective. From the outside perspective, Americans have been cheerfully trading liberty for security. And from the outside perspective, I'd say you got to stop doing that and try to undo as much as you can.
And the way to do that is our votes. I mean, we voted in legislatures who passed the Patriot Act and then who kept it. It's not part, I mean, most of it's not sunsetting. It's forever. And once legislation's on the books, it's so hard to overturn it. So there are a couple of senators that are trying to change the DMCA, for instance. One of them is in Virginia. I think either a senator or congressman, I'm not totally sure about that actually, but if you do want to say, hey, we're Americans, how did this happen? Vote and get the people in office who understand the technology and who understand the implications of it and can apply law to it as well. So our legislators and lawmakers and lawyers, a lot of them are often, I think, about a decade behind most of the people here in the technology industry.
And the fundamental flaw is that their qualification is that they won a popularity contest. They're not actually qualified to do the job necessarily.
I think depending on the content, who's making the laws, such as who's passing the laws that relate to technology. EFF is doing a fantastic job of reminding our legislatures of things that some of them may have forgotten or don't know how they apply to technology or aren't thinking what DRM means for business, what anti-circumvention measures mean for innovating and keeping up with China and other countries that don't quite have as strict laws about that, and how much more difficult it can make it in America to reverse engineer products. Legislatures need to learn that.
We got 5 minutes. We went all the way that way. Want to go back this way?
Throw out one concept for you that the key to your encryption key is not actually the encryption. So
Yeah.
therefore it's not protected.
It's a lock. Yeah. It's not the software.
The statement was the encryption key is not evidence, it's just the key.
Sorry, to making your key, what is that?
To make can you protect yourself by making your key a full confession? You'd have to retype that so many times in a day that you might just make it happen so that you could stop retyping it. And we're, yep. Okay, so the question is, IP addresses can sometimes, but usually not, be traced to an individual. How does that relate to usernames in logical authentication environments? The example being given is Second Life. Most people don't know this. Business is conducted in a world that doesn't actually exist. Unfortunately, again, blame Canada, William Gibson had this crazy idea about a consensual hallucination called space. And it's actually happening where businesses exist in that space. They offer advice and information. Commerce is conducted. Can you be traced to that username? How do you protect that username? I think you're on the hook.
Yeah, and actually, I'd love to answer this question. I hope it's not a shameless plug for a talk I'm doing at DEF CON, but it's going to sound like it. We have a case right now that we're going to be talking about a disclosure of some privacy security vulnerabilities at universities. And it's a case where a student has written some code that does MAC address spoofing. I know that is something that's been out there for a while. It's built into the Linux kernel, but it does MAC address spoofing. And the way this is going to affect other cases is we looked at the code. It did something interesting with reverse DNS lookup. And what we found out is that there are a lot of universities using real names as host names. So that information through reverse DNS lookups is being broadcast to the public. Now, there's a criminal cybercrimes case going on in Maine where someone is being prosecuted for, you were on this IP address at this time when this crime occurred. And one of the defenses that is going to be interesting is the students' research is going to show that not only can you spoof MAC addresses, and you can obviously spoof IP addresses as well as an extension of that at universities, maybe at the same time this type of thing was happening, but also the real name and username. If you're sitting on someone else's MAC address, even though you think you're looking at someone's real name as the host name, it could be you can jump on anyone else's MAC address at that time. So if you want to preserve some of your digital civil liberties about identity, this being used against you, do security research and talk about it at conferences, because talking about it at this conference is going to help some cybercrimes cases by saying, hey, I figured out a way that I can spoof this. I can make this look like something it's not. I found this hole. If there are other cases out there that the prosecution is relying on an address, a username, they're going to have to work, as they know they do. They work very hard, but they're going to have to work a little bit harder to show that that was that person at that time that did have access, that did that particular thing. So by talking about what you're doing and publishing it, you're telling people about vulnerabilities, but you're also, I believe, helping your digital civil liberties and making these cases a little bit easier for defense.
And from a technical standpoint, the age of the password is over. We need to stop using passwords for authentication. The sooner that we can get that fixed, the better. Get token auth built into Second Life. It's past time. Should be there.
Okay.
One more quick question? Nope. Thank you
Thank you
very
very
much
much
for coming.